JustShare, for those of you who don't know, is a coalition of churches and development agencies seeking to keep the poorest communities of the globe in the eye of the City of London in particular. I'm the parish priest at St Mary Le Bow in Cheapside, and that's one of the places where JustShare has its home, and in fact JustShare has its desk here when the office is in fact open. I was looking at an article on the BBC website in which it was talking about somebody who was really finding in this time very difficult to make ends meet for her family, and pointing out that, of course, for a lot of us, we've got a bit of spare cash because we're not buying a pint or our cups of coffee and all that sort of thing, and all those treats, and that therefore we've got money to spend when this is all over. But of course, this person hadn't got any of those treats in the first place. And it was a very vivid expression of where the inequality lies in an obvious way. And of course, ever since the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, Christians have understood that sacrificial service of those in need is a specific and a necessary expression of love for the Lord Jesus. It's a given. Nowadays, of course, mission has become specifically associated with evangelism and church growth. Yet only a generation ago, many Christians understood mission as offerings of medical care, social support and education, perhaps most often beyond these shores. But there have been missions in the UK, often settlements in which advantaged people would work for and alongside poor communities. Or Christian communities would offer particular charisms in schools or hospitals. Call the Midwife on the telly is probably a not very accurate example of that sort of genre. Christians, I reckon, in the UK have a proud record of involvement in, for example, the abolition of slavery, the improvement of factory conditions, and of course, education and medicine. There are still some survivals of this. Chaplains in hospitals are paid for by the state. That doesn't happen elsewhere. And every person held in solitary confinement in prison is bound to be seen daily by a priest. When I was ordained to an inner city parish 35 years ago, the time of the report Faith in the City during the Thatcher administration, poverty was evident and widespread. When I was a curate in Leeds, there was a distribution of the Butter Mountain, the European Butter Mountain, and it was revealing of an underclass who one didn't otherwise see, who emerged, as it were, from nowhere. For there were no feeding programs and there were no night shelters in those days. And once again, the church has been at the forefront of the challenge in both those areas because the church is local and resourceful and faithful. But despite some sterling service, people have not found this witness enough to stem the tide away from church attendance. To navigate the present scenario of economic inequality and plight, and also ecclesial ambition, I'm delighted to introduce to you Simon Perfect, who, apart from many other distinctions, sits on the steering group of JustShare, representing one of our partners at St James's Piccadilly. Simon is a researcher at Theos, which is a think tank, and the author of the Theos report, Bridging the Gap, Economic Inequality and Church Responses in the UK. He's also an associate tutor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he has led courses about Muslim communities in minority settings. His other research interests include British Islam, religious education, and issues to do with religion and freedom of speech in universities. And he's recently co-authored a book on freedom of speech in universities, which will be published by Routledge next month. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. First, can I check that you can hear me? Thumbs up. That's brilliant. Fantastic. I'm going to share my screen. So yes, thank you very much for having me here today. As George has said, I'm a researcher at Theos, the Religion and Society think tank, and I'm going to be talking about a report that I wrote and published earlier last year, Bridging the Gap, Economic Inequality and Church Responses in the UK. And this report is about exploring the scale of income and wealth inequality in the UK. And it also considers how churches have been responding to it, both practically and theologically. I should say we started this work before COVID, so the primary sort of economic shock that we were anticipating was going to be Brexit. That has obviously been eclipsed over the last year by COVID. So there are multiple things occurring there. But this project has now become clearly more important than ever before. I should say that you can download our report for free from the Theos website, or if you're feeling generous, you can buy a beautiful hard copy like this for only £5 from the website. That's my obligatory sales pitch done there. So I'm going to use this time to talk a little bit through this report. I'm going to start by talking about the scale of economic inequality in the UK in terms of wealth and income. Talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on existing inequalities. And then we'll talk a little bit about why economic inequality is a problem. We might have a sense that it's we have an instinctual sense that it is unfair, but why might we say that it is a problem for society, and a problem in particular for everybody, not just the poor. And then finally, I'll think about how churches can respond. And my argument is that churches are obviously doing a huge amount of good to address poverty, but they're perhaps less good at trying to address inequality, the gap between rich and poor. They have been doing some things, but there's arguably more that they could be doing. And so we'll draw those things out. Okay. So let's start by going through the scale of economic inequality in the UK. The next few slides here, I'm drawing on graphs that have been helpfully prepared by the Institute for Fiscal Studies in their recent reports on inequality. And some of you will know that the IFS are doing a big review of inequalities called being led by Angus Deaton. So, talking about the scales of economic inequality, there are different ways of measuring economic inequality here. If we focus on the green line here, we're looking at the Gini coefficient, and this is one of the dominant ways of measuring inequality of wealth or income. 0 in the Gini coefficient means total equality, and 1 means total inequality. In 2017 to 18 in the UK's Gini coefficient was, for income inequality, was 0.34. And to put that in context, that's one of the highest levels of income inequality in Europe and in the OECD. From this graph, looking at that green line, we can see that income inequality rose considerably in the 1980s, but since the 1990s, it has been more stable, though still very high. Another way of measuring inequality is by income shares, and that's about comparing how much income is received by people near the top of the distribution compared to how much is received by those lower down the distribution. If we look at this yellow line, the yellow axis, it shows the 90-10 ratio. And that shows that in 2017 to 18, someone at the 90th percentile of the distribution, right near the top, had an income that was 4 times higher than someone at the 10th percentile near the bottom. Again, we can see that inequality in terms of income shares is considerably higher than it was in the 1960s, though that seems to have dropped slightly than it was in the 1990s. We can zoom in further on economic inequality by focusing what's happened right at the top 1% of the income distribution. Here we can see that in 2017, the top 1% of households received 8% of the country's whole disposable household income. And that's greater than it was a few decades ago. So overall, clearly, the richest people have got richer. In part, this is because there's been a huge rise in the size of executive pay packages, so the CEOs in their remuneration, while earnings for the average worker have stagnated over this period. That's looking at income inequality. Wealth inequality, which takes into account your wider assets as well, your property, for example. Wealth inequality in the UK is even greater than income inequality. The wealthiest 10% of households own 45% of the country's wealth, so nearly half of the country's wealth. But the least wealthy half of households only own 9% of the country's wealth. Now, there's lots of different factors driving economic inequality. Some of these are long-term structural factors. We could give an example, for example, the shift over the long term from manufacturing to services, which has obviously benefited some regions more than others. Wages have stagnated for many workers over the long term, while executive pay packages have risen. In part, that's because CEOs in a global economy, they're much more competitive, and global companies are competing for top CEOs, so their pay packages keep rising. Home ownership, of course, is a massive factor in driving inequality, and there's a big difference clearly between those who own their property and those who don't. And there are also specific government policies which can drive inequality, and different organizations draw attention to different policies, which they say these are the key ones that have been driving inequality. The Institute for Public Policy Research, the IPPR, for example, draws attention to changes in inheritance tax that they say have particularly benefited the rich. Benefit cuts, meanwhile, have obviously held back the household income for those lower down the scale. We also know that capital gains are taxed at a much lower rate than income tax. So if you're able to convert your income to capital gains, you can find ways of paying less tax. One striking figure that I found looking through a very useful report by Church Action for Tax Justice says that 1 in 10 people earning more than £1 million pay less than 11% in tax, which is less than somebody who is earning just £15,000 a year. So there's a big disproportion in the proportion that you might be paying tax the higher you go because of capital gains tax differences. COVID is clearly exacerbating economic inequalities, both income and wealth, and other forms of inequality as well. Globally, the pandemic is hitting the poorest countries the hardest, as we know. There's now some real concern about famine in particular countries. And now we're seeing a different kind of inequality between those countries that are able to get hold of a vaccine and stockpile a vaccine and those which are not. I want to focus on COVID's impact on UK inequalities in particular. I'm again drawing on some useful graphs that have been prepared by the IFS for this. So in this image, we can see 4 graphs showing the characteristics of workers who were in sectors that have been locked down over the last year. In particular, non-food, non-pharmaceutical retail sectors, people working in some of the transport sectors like taxi services, hotels, restaurants, people in the arts, people in leisure services. These are the people who've been hit hardest economically by COVID and the necessary lockdowns. Just some overall observations. We can see that women have been impacted more than men in these shutdown sectors. People in these shutdown sectors tend to be younger. Workers under the age of 25 are twice as likely to be in a shutdown sector than those in any other age category. If you look at the bottom left graph there, you can see that people in these shutdown sectors tend to be those in the lower income brackets. Employees in the bottom 10% of weekly earnings are 7 times more likely to be in shutdown sectors than those in the top 10%. We also know that certain ethnic minority groups have been hit harder by lockdown than others. We can see that about 30% of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis work in these shutdown sectors compared to about 15% of white people. So younger workers, people on low incomes, much more likely to have lost their job, to see a reduction in their earnings than older and higher income workers. And people, of course, who are already in precarious work situations, those who are self-employed or on zero hours contract in particular, have been badly hit. Many of those people in lower income households will have found it very difficult to cut back on spending because they're already spending a high proportion of their income on the essentials, rent, utilities, groceries. In fact, according to a survey of the workforce done before COVID, nearly a third of low-income households said that they couldn't manage a month if they were to lose their main source of income. Meanwhile, those people living in higher income households usually spend a much larger proportion of their income on things like hospitality, leisure, cultural activities. Those are things that have been shut down. So higher income households have been saving that money that they would have usually spent on leisure activities, but the lack of demand for those activities directly affects people on the lower incomes. All that adds up to us seeing increasing economic inequality between those who are relatively rich and those who are relatively poor. Whether or not you can do your job from home is another big factor of this, of course. 80% of people working in shutdown sectors are unlikely to be able to work from home compared to only a quarter of people in the top 10% of incomes. Londoners, it turns out, are the people most likely to be able to do their job from home. Education has also taken a massive hit, of course, through COVID, and it's clear from the data that higher income households have been more successful at providing educational opportunities for their children than lower income households. Children in the top fifth of the income distribution are spending over an hour more a day on education than kids in the bottom fifth. So those educational disparities that are already there are only going to be exacerbated even further by COVID. Finally, of course, we know that there is a clear connection between where you live and your health, and that's been exacerbated even further by COVID. On this graph, we can see mortality rates comparing pre-COVID and COVID last year, focusing on March 2020 to April 2020. The yellow bars show all the deaths between March and April, adjusted for age in the least deprived areas on the left, and then it moves up to the most deprived areas on the right. And the green bars show the specific deaths by COVID. So you can see here that people living in the most deprived areas clearly have been far more vulnerable to COVID, more likely to die. And we know there are various factors leading to that: underlying health problems, crowded housing, more likely to work in sectors that make you more vulnerable. Okay. So clearly, economic inequality is a huge problem. It's growing, and COVID is going to make this a situation that is even worse than it has been previously. But we might want to ask ourselves, why do we find economic inequality a problem? I think we have an instinctive sense that high levels of economic inequality are unfair. But what might the research say about why in practice these levels of economic inequality are bad for society? And there are various arguments that have been put forward by...
Simon, could I just interject?
...working on this. Firstly, some of these social scientists argue that in wealthy societies, as economic inequality increases, social mobility and equality of opportunity are reduced. So the children of richer parents are more likely to remain rich. Children of poorer parents are more likely to remain poor. There's stickiness at the extremes of the distribution. In particular, this is because children of richer parents are more likely to be able to access good schools, further embedding their pre-existing advantages. There seems to be some research suggesting that in countries where there's high levels of economic inequality, levels of trust in democracy and meritocracy and their benefits goes down. We might also argue that high economic inequality undermines political equality, the political equality that democracy depends upon, because the richest people are able to exert a much greater influence over politics than everybody else, particularly through the media and social media. And we are obviously seeing in the last few years, we've obviously seen the real impact of that. There are also various arguments that in wealthy countries, the greater the economic inequality, the lower the overall health of the population, the physical health of the population. This is an argument that's been made in particular by Professor Michael Marmot, who's the director of the UCL Institute of Health Equity. Some of you will have seen in the news that he published a report last year that got a lot of press coverage showing that the health gap has grown between wealthy and deprived areas over the last 10 years. Now, there are lots of ongoing debates about these different points that I've just made, in particular debate about what the particular mechanism might be that connects high inequality and these various problematic consequences. One of the theories made by Michael Marmot and also by others, famously by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, authors of the best-selling book, The Spirit Level, which came out in 2009. Their argument is that when you live in a highly unequal society, perceiving yourself to be lower in status itself can lead to anxiety and mental and then physical health problems. So they argue there's a psychosocial link between high levels of inequality and physical health. And crucially, they argue that this affects everybody on the economic gradient, explaining why the overall population's health is lower in more unequal countries. So their argument is you need to care about high levels of economic inequality, even if you are relatively well off. It affects you. So far, I've been talking about from the kind of social scientific research, but now I want to shift gears and think about the church. Where does the church sit in this? Obviously, the churches are doing a huge amount of work to alleviate poverty, but my argument is that they need to be thinking about this gap between rich and poor as well, because this gap between rich and poor is bad for everybody. Often what churches do on economic inequality goes unreported. There's a lot of unsung good work going on here. Churches need to be better at telling their story of what they're doing on economic inequality, both to their own churchgoers as well as to the wider public. And I think there are various ways in which churches can use this particular moment to really make a difference. Firstly, on a national level, churches can be using their influence as investors and shareholders to tackle key issues like tax avoidance and excessive executive pay. Churches on a national level are wealthy organizations, and they are using already their wealth to influence the business world. Again, this is something that often goes unreported, unsung work from the churches. For example, in the Church of England, there are various national investing bodies, such as the Church Commissioners and the Pensions Board, and they are using their positions as shareholders in companies to push them to behave more ethically. They'll often vote against the CEOs where there's a lack of tax transparency, or if they think their executives are being paid excessively, or if there are unpaid, unpublished pay ratios, or there's no gender diversity on the boards. In this way, they're helping to tackle these key issues of tax avoidance and excessive executive pay, which are important drivers of economic inequality. So the churches are already doing some key work here that often goes unreported. As an important aside, it's also worth saying that these investment bodies are really doing important work on climate change, which again deserves more coverage than it gets. They're playing a really key role in pushing companies to transition to a low carbon economy. Some of you will know that the Church of England co-founded the Transition Pathway Initiative in 2017. And this is an initiative that evaluates how companies are doing based upon the extent to which they are moving into alignment with the Paris Agreement. And that's been really important for helping ethical investors globally to work together to pressure companies to transition away from fossil fuels. Following COVID, we want to see churches at a national level going even further than they are already, using their investment power to tackle economic inequality where they can. We're encouraging them to think about how they might use, on a national level, their investment strategies to prioritize the reduction of inequality. One way to do this might be through impact investing for equality purposes. Impact investing is where you invest in initiatives where you're likely to get some financial return, but more importantly, you're looking to get a positive societal gain. And there's quite a lot of promise in impact investing for helping organizations like, on a national level, churches to invest in initiatives that could bring about greater equality. For example, in impact investing in initiatives that support entrepreneurs from marginal communities, that would be a way to help tackle inequality on certain levels. Churches are starting to explore this kind of thing of impact investing. The Catholic Church, for example, has held 3 big conferences on impact investing, and the Church of England has started to release small funds to experiment in this area. But this is quite a promising area where they could be doing more. These big issues of economic inequality are structural issues, but there are some things I think that local churches can be doing to help respond to both drivers and consequences of economic inequality. One of them is to get involved in community organizing where they're not already, and through that to try and identify possible drivers of local inequality. For example, local companies that are not paying their workers a living wage, for example. Community organizing organizations like Citizens UK are great examples of the ways in which churches can form local alliances in order to work together to tackle some of these kinds of issues. Local churches also need to be talking more about wealth, not just about poverty. Individual Christians, I think, need to be more confident talking about money and starting to see financial choices as faith choices. Who we bank with, who we invest with. We need to be thinking about how these decisions express who we are as Christians seeking to love other people. I'd also suggest that we also need to be thinking more positively about tax, changing our attitude to tax. And this is certainly something that the Church Action for Tax Justice is campaigning for, in wanting local churches to be encouraging conversations among their congregations about about having a positive attitude to tax. Church leaders might lack confidence sometimes in opening up conversations about money and how we use our money for ethical purposes among their congregations. But there are resources available for church leaders thinking to do this. I would particularly recommend resources from the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, the ECCR, which helps local churches talk about money. Finally, and most importantly, I think, as we look to a difficult economic recovery, I think we want churches at a national level to be stepping up as voices for greater economic equality, greater equality both nationally and internationally. In recent years, church leaders have been starting to speak out more about economic inequality rather than just poverty. Archbishop Justin Welby has written about this. He's called economic inequality the most destabilizing and unjust feature of our own society. And some people will remember that in 2014, Pope Francis gave a famous tweet where he said that inequality is the root of social evil. So church leaders individually are starting to call out economic inequality. But I think there's space for saying that churches could be doing more on a corporate level, issuing more formal corporate statements condemning the high levels of economic inequality. There was a proposal that was put to Synod, the Church of England Synod, in February last year, that was calling on the church to make a public condemnation of the high levels of economic inequality, but due to a lack of time in the Synod, that motion wasn't debated in the end. But those kinds of public corporate statements might be more effective than individual statements from individual leaders. COVID has of course been galvanizing interventions from churches, particularly interventions on calling for immediate policies that might make a difference to those families who are suffering. An example of this is there have been some calls from churches for the government to initiate a policy of cancelling unavoidable household debt for those people of lower incomes. The Reset the Debt campaign was a campaign launched last year by the Baptist Union, Church of Scotland, Church Action on Poverty, and the Methodist Union and the URC, and that's calling on the government to create what they call a Jubilee Fund. Jubilee, as some of you will know, the principle in the Old Testament of both cancelling debts every 50 years, but also returning land to the original family group who owned it, as a way of curbing intergenerational economic inequality. So some churches the churches are making particular interventions, calling for immediate relief to for those who are suffering from COVID. I think that churches can be playing an important role challenging our complacency over inequality. I think there's a tendency now that we get used to the fact that a very small number of people are getting richer and richer and concentrating the wealth of the world in their hands, whilst everybody else is not sharing in that, or in some cases getting poorer. Churches have got a place in which they can be using their local voice and their national voice to continuously remind us that this is not okay, challenging our complacency here. I would also argue that churches can use their voice nationally and locally to seed new ideas into this conversation, ideas drawing upon Christian theology. Sometimes the debate about economic inequality can become stagnant or the same kind of arguments. So it's helpful to think about how can this be rephrased. There's an important theological case to be made that today's high levels of inequality are a spiritual problem as much as a problem for our democracy and for other factors like our physical health. Different theologians have thought about this in different ways. For example, arguing that excessive inequality undermines human solidarity and the common good. Solidarity is a key concept in Catholic social teaching. It means the pursuit of the common good, the pursuit of wanting to see everybody flourish. We could argue that high levels of inequality undermine that key concept of solidarity because the richest people are able to isolate themselves from others, losing sight of their interdependence and responsibility for others. I think this concept of solidarity is a key one that, although it's in this sense it's coming from a Christian lens, it is easily translatable into secular terms. So I think here is quite a fruitful language for the church to be talking about inequality that would have resonance with wider society. Other theological arguments we might make against high levels of economic inequality, we might argue that it masks the truth of human worth because it encourages us to value ourselves based upon our economic position. And a third, we might argue that high levels of economic inequality encourages sin. It encourages the rich to become defensive of their wealth and proud, and it might encourage envy among the poor. These different theological arguments emphasize that high levels of economic inequality are bad for everybody. They're bad for the spiritual health of everybody, whether on low incomes, middle incomes, or high incomes. And that is a key message for the church to be making, both locally in their local congregations and also at a national level. At Theos, we are undertaking some further research into this to try and build a more developed theological response to inequality. Summing up then, as we seek to rebuild from COVID, we need to make this a turning point. Currently, it looks like the economic inequality is going to get worse because of COVID, both within the UK and between different countries. And this is something that everybody needs to be concerned about because the impact of high levels of inequality affects everybody. There is a danger, I fear, that after COVID, we go back to the status quo, that we forget about the lessons that we've learned, we forget about the contributions of key workers, that we forget, and in our focus on trying to go back to normalcy, we don't seize the opportunity to make change. But we mustn't do this. Churches, I think, have got a key role to play here in using their voice on a national and local level to keep economic inequality on the government's agenda and to be offering a more hopeful vision for society, to say that our economy does not have to work this way. It does not have to be prioritizing. It does not have to be about the prioritizing of individual wealth and well-being. There can be other ways of looking at the economy and society. I'll stop there and look forward to your Q&A. Thank you very much.